And this story, it was more solidly sourced and corroborated than mountains of anti-Trump stories that came out over the past 4 years that collapsed under minimal factual scrutiny. And yet none of those stories was censored.
To get Brexit done.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, this is Stephen Edgington from The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Sohrab Ahmari. Sohrab Ahmari grew up in revolutionary Iran and moved to America when he was a young teenager. He is now the op-ed editor at the New York Post. We're going to be talking all about the US election, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. He also has a book coming out next year called The Unbroken Thread. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Donald Trump is launching a series of lawsuits across the country. Do we expect him to retain the presidency? Is there any chance that these lawsuits could come to fruition for him?
You know, I've been following it as much as I had been able to, and my sense is it's a very, very long shot. I wouldn't entirely rule it out because who knows? But look, most of the concerning changes that took place were legal changes where Democrats went to state courts and changed election rules in terms of how late ballots could come in. And so that, mail-in ballots, that is. So that is, it will be litigated, I guess, at least with Pennsylvania, it will be litigated at the Supreme Court. I just don't see what would happen theoretically if the Supreme Court said, yes, X number of ballots are invalid. And with the number of states that are now where Biden flipped them, even if, let's say, the Supreme Court somehow gives Pennsylvania or Arizona to the president, that itself just seems unlikely to me. Even that, if that does happen, how will it change the overall outcome? I just don't see it. Now, on the other hand, what I would say is, look, legally speaking, the president has every right to pursue every legal channel and exhaust every legal channel, and then we'll see what happens. I mean, he's not doing anything unusual. You know, the 2000 election in Florida was very close, and Al Gore didn't concede until well into December, as you know. So I don't see what the rush is to, you know, this sort of wall of mainstream media coverage that just keeps saying president-elect and Trump is wrong. He's making false statements. It's like, let him go through the process. He has the right. As I just said, I think it's a long, very, very long shot of changing the outcome. But, you know, we have legal mechanisms in place, and the media are not who our Constitution designates as who gets to call the final outcome of an election. State electors do, and courts and so forth might get involved, not what the New York Times editorial board says. So that's it. You know, I just think let him exhaust his options, and certainly it's true that 4 years ago, the Democrats didn't accept his legitimacy, and they never accepted it for the following 4 years. So I don't see if he's under any moral obligation to make it easy for Mr. Biden.
Well, this is an interesting point, because is there a hypocrisy here where a lot of the media, Democrats, are saying this is tarnishing Donald Trump's reputation, his legacy, he should be respecting the outcome of the Democratic election. And as you say, maybe Hillary Clinton was one of those voices who didn't necessarily accept that she lost in 2016.
Yep. I mean, she continued to say that the election was stolen from me, robbed from me, so on and so forth, up until a couple of weeks ago. Joe Biden, when he was pressed on whether or not it had been stolen or fraudulently taken by the Team Trump, he said yes, even though that's just empirically not true. You know, the media Democrats and the media allies spent 4 years pursuing the quote-unquote collusion theory. And just to be very clear for your viewers, the Robert Mueller special counsel determined that there was no collusion between Trump, Team Trump, and the Kremlin. No collusion. And yet it persisted as a myth on the left that they continue to use to fire up their own people and to, I think, damage the system, because now there's an inclination on the right to, now that Biden appears to have won, some on the right are like, well, no, it's not legitimate either. It introduced into the system this permanent uncertainty over who has really won. So the hypocrisy is absolutely real.
In your mind, how could you quickly sum up Donald Trump's legacy? Now, obviously, a big part of that is the investigations and the impeachment and all of these, huge problems that he's gone throughout his presidency. But how would you sum up his legacy?
I think his legacy is a leader who saw that the left-right, center-left consensus that had governed America since the end of the Cold War, or arguably even going back to the end of the Second World War, was not working for broad swaths of the American public. And it was working very well for an elite, people who own capital, and the professionals whose service capital did very well. But wide swaths of the working class got left behind by that consensus. It was full of stupid hypocrisies and stupid wars that he just was willing to call out as such. And that galvanized people to realize there's a possibility of having a more solidaristic society and a more realistic approach to the world that puts American workers and middle class first. Did he succeed in delivering for his people to the extent that one might hope? No, there were shortcomings, partly because he was hounded for 4 years by these false investigations and one thing after another, impeachment, collusion, blah, blah, blah. And partly because it's very difficult for any president to assert control over the bureaucracies of the federal government. Now add to it a president who is absolutely hated by the elite, not just the left, by a bipartisan elite. And he has his own shortcomings, as we know, his tweeting, his kind of mercurial personality, all that stuff. Nevertheless, after all of that, he managed to expand his vote among those very voters, working class people, and to expand it dramatically in the case of Hispanic and Black working class people, African-American men, young African-American men, after 4 years during which we were told that the Trumpian uprising is racist, just an expression of white resentment, downscale whites that can't put up with demographic change. After all of that, you had a situation in which some majority minority district, Hispanic districts in Florida and Texas either went for Trump or came very close for Trump. So it appears that his people felt that he delivered as much as he could have for them. And that's a kind of a more working class politics than America has had for a long time.
Let's talk about his foreign policy briefly. Now, I know that you grew up in Iran, and it's interesting to note, and well, it's not that interesting really, but the fact that you're sort of an ethnic minority, I suppose, or at least you're not white, and you're supporting in many ways President Trump. Now Joe Biden is looking likely to be president. What do you expect in terms of his foreign policy in the Middle East? Do you expect to go back to this idea of let's go in foreign wars? Because Donald Trump was obviously very against that.
Yeah, one of the great things about the Trump 4 years was for the first time America didn't launch stupid wars abroad. I've been around for a while in this business now, and I started out supporting various American adventures in democratizing the Middle East. But look, after a decade, you realize that doesn't work, and that the best thing America can do is just stand by its allies and help strengthen the Arab state system and encourage them to take more responsibility over their own destiny and over their own security. And the result of that after 4 years is no new wars. We're pulling out of Afghanistan as much as he can, no regime change wars. And you have a number of new peace deals between these three Arab states and Israel. So that's, I think, one of the most precious parts of the Trump legacy is his approach, which wasn't isolationism, but it's a kind of realism shorn of any illusions about American power being used to reshape, Arab Muslim societies. We'll see what Joe Biden does. I did notice some alarming sounds that Kamala Harris, his running mate, had made in an interview recently. She said, we look forward to once again working with our quote pro-democracy and civil society partners in Syria. Who? What? What is who's the pro-democracy partners in Syria? Syria is like this wasteland now, contested by jihadists and Russia and the Assad regime. I just hope we don't go back to what's called liberal internationalism here, which is this kind of America as a busybody. Meanwhile, look at our society. We barely manage to govern ourselves. What business do we have telling Belarus or Syria, whoever, how to govern themselves? If we can just, defend our friends, reward our friends, punish our enemies without needlessly starting wars, I think that's good enough for many Americans. And I really do hope that that rhetoric from Mrs. Harris, or soon to be Vice President Harris, is just rhetoric and it doesn't actually bear out in policy, though, we'll see.
Well, it's fascinating to watch the media now obviously describe, or many parts of the media describe President Trump as, the worst president we've ever had, a racist, awful rhetoric. And as you say, when you compare him to previous recent presidents, he hasn't gone into these foreign wars and made these mistakes. But ultimately, and let's stick on the election just for now, the election result. Ultimately, Joe Biden did win. I mean, looks like he won the election. Why? Why did he win that, or looks like he's won that election?
Well, I mean, the temptation of any losing side, and I am a conservative, a temptation of every losing side is to try to cast blame everywhere else. But, we gotta, every time there's that's a good rule in life that, the first thing you do when you're faced with failure is look at yourself. And, I mentioned, like Donald Trump had a really polarizing personality. The people who loved him because he made the kind of Washington, New York elite class, media class, he made them cry, and it's enjoyable for partisans to drink each other's tears, as it were. It's tasty, but that also meant that there were a lot of people, particularly it seems like white women, suburban women, upper middle class women who may have been inclined to vote for a Republican but found him distasteful. There was an impression for much of his administration of constant chaos, and I think voters just find it exhausting. Now, some of that chaos is the fact that he was, like, let's say, some of the more pugnacious Brexiteers are going up against an entire establishment who's invested in a certain worldview of Britain as part of the European Union, free movement, blah, blah, blah. And then you come these people saying, hey, what about our sovereignty? We reject your entire worldview, your entire consensus. And that's bound to rankle feathers. But some of it was just genuine, chaos that I lived under the Obama administration. I disagreed with his policies often vehemently, but you couldn't deny that there was this sort of a tight ship in the White House. You didn't have a leak a minute. So, that sense of chaos, I think, exhausted people. Now, having done all the let's blame ourselves, a few other factors that were out of his control. Global pandemic is not something that Donald Trump did. It hit every developed country in the world. And if you look at the economic recovery that we mounted under Trump the past few months, the fact that you have this huge growth again after dramatic declines suggests that the Trump economy was sound to begin with, so that even the damage done by the lockdowns at least could begin to be repaired very quickly. That's not his fault. Then you had just a media that is 4 years saw itself not as reporting information and just letting voters make up their minds, but determined to shape every message. If you looked at the headlines in the Washington Post, New York Times, and others, every headline was like, president makes baseless claims about baseless things. He's baseless claims. And that has an effect. Eventually, people constantly see. And if you dug into any one of those cases, and believe me, as a tired partisan, I have just a mental archive of them. It was always more complicated. But at any rate, so you had this sort of wall-to-wall negative coverage. And then last thing, I think most alarming we should talk about is the fact that big tech played a big role in censoring pro-Trump voices or anti-Trump stories. I work for the New York Post. We had a big expose about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and his dealings based on a laptop, which was clearly belonged to him, and emails that were recovered from that laptop showing that apparently Hunter Biden set up meetings between executives for this Ukrainian energy firm Burisma, where he was serving as a member of the board and drawing a salary of at least $50,000 a month. he set up meetings between executives at that firm and his father, when his father was the second most powerful man in the world and the Obama administration's point man on Ukraine. That story was basically removed from vast swaths of the internet by Twitter and Facebook, and our Twitter account was locked for about two weeks on a completely ridiculous basis that we had put up hacked information, even though it wasn't hacked information. At any rate, so you see the way, I'm not saying it was a conspiracy, but the elite classes and their various organs, the media, big tech, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, large corporations, all lined up together in a way that was just so obvious, where, if you were Trumpian conservatives, you really felt like you weren't facing an opposition, you were facing a regime. And so combine all of that, and I think it's not too bad of a performance to have narrowly lost the election and barely lost, gained seats in the House of Representatives and held on to the Senate. All told, it's not a bad outcome when you weigh the force of the opposition.
Well, this is an interesting point, and I want to talk about the Hunter Biden story and social media companies and other media organizations in a moment. But let's again just stick on the election result. You've mentioned there the Democrats didn't gain the Senate, or they haven't just yet. It's likely that the Republicans will hold the Senate, and they've picked up seats in the House. So obviously, when the media called the election for Joe Biden, I mean, you may disagree with me, but I sort of thought that the Democrats, instead of being jubilant, they sort of had a sigh of relief. Why do you think that some of them weren't quite as happy with this result as they could have been?
Well, because they were expecting a blue wave. A blue wave election would have been not only Trump gets thumped in the Electoral College, which he wasn't. I mean, he lost, but not by much. And they were expecting to unseat lots more Republicans, and they failed to do that. And not only they failed to do that, they lost some of their own seats. And so the blue wave turned to be what Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, called a blue trickle. And that was the disappointment. And now it's interesting to me because the right has usually the side who loses goes through internal recriminations and reproaches and blame and see who was at fault. I'm seeing less of that on my side. I see more of that on the left, where they're saying, why did we fail? And that's because the House Democrats went too far left. The slogan "defund the police" or "abolish policing," "abolish jails," prisons is insane. What are you talking about? The police officer? You want to get rid of the police? And by the way, it's not me saying that. Someone like Representative James Clyburn is an African-American lawmaker, veteran of the civil rights movement, but older, was on Axios. I don't know if you know this outlet, it's a US outlet, saying, yeah, that slogan hurt us a lot, to abolish the police. It's too crazy. It scares people. And you combine that with some of the rioting we saw over the summer, where Democratic governors and mayors, and including Joe Biden himself, were reluctant to condemn, just utter thuggery on the streets, reluctant to just say that, law and order is good, which is the basis of what all civil society is law and order. And so I think it's just the radicalisms scared the American public, and they paid a price for it.
Do you think that many were surprised? I mean, many Democrats, and I don't like lumping them all in with the media, but I think that you can largely do that to an extent. Many people in the media and the Democrats, do you think they were surprised that just so many people voted Republican? I think it was about 70 million in the end. Obviously, Joe Biden got a few million more than that. But he increased his vote share and it didn't go down. And obviously they sort of built Trump up as this huge, evil dictator, worst human being in the world. And yet so many Americans still went out and voted for him.
Yeah, they were shocked, and also because they got high on their own supply, so to speak, namely the polls. Remember that all the polls, with a few exceptions, leading up to the election were showing Biden was like a 12, 13, 14, 17-point lead in key battlegrounds that ended up being, in fact, neck and neck. And those polls, by the way, serve an ideological purpose, to be completely frank, because they, whether intended or not, what they do, depending on how you weigh polls, as you know, it's the same in Britain, how you weight polls in Britain, you can kind of shape the outcome of the polls. And what they do is when one side feels like their candidate isn't doing well in the polls consistently, they're more reluctant to vote because they think, well, I don't want to vote for a loser. And so, and again, I'm not suggesting it was a conspiracy or concerted effort to do this, but pollsters begin with certain assumptions, like, for example, like you just said, Trump is a monster and no one would want to vote for him. And how they sample voters and so forth led to a certain numeric outcome that got utterly crushed by reality.
Well, what was funny was there are certain people like Nate Silver, the New York Times, and other pollsters who were just laughing at what they called Republican pollsters, Trafalgar Group, people like that, who are far more accurate with their polls than what I might call Democratic polls, or polls that showed Joe Biden was much further ahead than he actually was. So you're not saying there's quite a conspiracy there, but it's funny. Do you find it funny to see these so-called experts be proved so wrong on election night?
Be proved so wrong again, because this is precisely what they predicted in 2016 as well. So just a pollster begins with certain assumptions about American society, and the assumptions that our pollsters seem to be holding fast to was that the country is much more anti-Trump or much more on the left than it really turned out to be. That I think that's another source of that disappointment, is the contrast between polls and reality. And I think that should, this is a kind of a side point, but it should lead to a re-examination of the whole polling industry. To me, I joked on Twitter, it's sort of a modern pseudo-statistical version of the Roman art of augury, where you threw a bird and see where it went and it told you the fortunes. It's about, to me, after two sets of horrendous outcomes for the pollsters of catastrophically bad predictions, why not just throw the birds and see what they tell you about the outcome of the election?
Quite. One of my old jobs was working for a political party, and part of my responsibility was running polling, both internal and what I would describe as external polling. And I remember just we would call up polling companies and just see what we could get away with in terms of the questions that we would ask and things like that. And, we just used them as a weapon completely to try and manipulate the media. Polling in the UK, and I think it's pretty similar in America, is, relatively corrupt, I think, in some. Sure. Let's talk about the Hunter Biden story. Now, this was something that I found absolutely fascinating. Last couple of weeks of the election, you've already touched on what was involved, sort of the substance of the story. You worked for the New York Post. What was your role in this story, if any? And how did the New York
Nothing.
Post come by? Well, there you go. How did the New York Post come by this hard drive?
So I'm the op-ed editor. The UK analog to that is comment editor typically. So I oversee our opinion columnists, and I had nothing to do with the reporting or editing that went into this. When I learned that this story was dropping was when it dropped for the public, Thursday, October 10 or something. Don't quote me on that, but at any rate, so I learned alongside everyone else. But I sort of emerged as one of the Post public faces because it outraged me that we were being censored. How we got hold of it was that apparently Hunter Biden had dropped off this laptop. Hunter Biden or a representative had dropped off this laptop at a Delaware laptop repair shop, but never picked it up. So then the owner of the shop gained what's called constructive ownership, meaning you relinquish, you don't pay for the repairs, I keep the laptop. And he opened it up and he looked through it and he noticed that there was all this sort of political stuff and then also this more salacious private stuff. And we, by the way, we were completely transparent about all of this. We right away said it in our story. So he took it to the FBI, but before he gave it to the FBI, he made a copy of the hard drive. This guy was a Republican, and he made a copy of the hard drive and gave that to Rudy Giuliani's lawyer. Then in Trump world, there were rumors that such a laptop existed, and we heard about them through Steve Bannon, who's a former Trump advisor. And then we reached out to Rudy Giuliani and asked him for the laptop, and he gave us the laptop. Again, I had no role in any of this. I just learned about it afterward, but that's how it came about. We were we were transparent at every step. I mean, and this story, if your readers can find it, nypost.com, it was more solidly sourced and corroborated than mountains of anti-Trump stories that came out over the past 4 years that collapsed under minimal factual scrutiny. And yet none of those stories was censored. I just off the top of my head, the Steele dossier utterly turned out to be salacious crap that basically the Kremlin had planted against Trump. The claim that Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, had been in Prague to meet his Kremlin handlers, not true, utterly disproved by the Mueller special counsel report. The claim that President Trump had suborned perjury from Michael Cohen that appeared in BuzzFeed, that was shut down by the special counsel's office within 12 hours. Yet none of those stories was censored or removed from Facebook and Twitter. So the lopsidedness, the ratchet of social media censorship only seems to be a one-way ratchet. And that became so clear to me over this New York Post incident.
Well, I've worked on, with The Sun and various other newspapers, some pretty tricky stories legally, and working with pretty tough sources who want to remain anonymous and things like that, and having to go through investigations and stuff. And I've never really seen a newspaper be so open and transparent as the New York Post was, describing exactly how the information was obtained. And I thought that was extraordinary in itself. And then for Twitter, as you say, to block people even clicking on the link on their platform, and Facebook obviously said that they were going to limit the reach of the story until they'd managed to independently verify it. What was the motivation, do you think, for them doing that when, as you say, they don't do this to the Democrats, they don't do this to other stories which are anti-Trump, which don't have anywhere near as much transparency in terms of how they were obtained, for example?
By the way, the side note on this is that this Facebook official who announced that Facebook was reducing circulation on our story, Andy Stone, used to work for Democratic lawmakers for the Senator Barbara Boxer of California and for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So it's just so naked. What's the motivation? Look, I think several. One is that these organizations, like most organizations in our white collar elite world, are staffed by like ultra woke 20-year-olds. And so there's even if someone like Mark Zuckerberg is uncomfortable with this kind of censorship, he's under pressure from his own kind of tier of mid-level engineers and so forth who are very lefty, even support Antifa and kind of very hard left stuff, even as they make $400,000 a year, whatever, working in Menlo Park, California. But anyway, that's one factor, is the staffing. Just like in newsrooms, just like in corporate America, it's just infiltration of the woke. Another factor in this is the fact that particularly Facebook faced a lot of pressure after the 2016 election. It was blamed for Trump's victory because it was relatively free and you could share anything on Facebook. And as you know, the Russians did try to do some minor kind of efforts to basically posting what I call boomer memes, like pictures of Hillary shaking hands with the devil while Donald Trump is sitting there signing a law with like our Lord Jesus Christ, like putting his hands over his shoulders. Yes, that kind of thing the Russians did do, but that's not why Hillary lost. She lost because she was an uncomfortable, unpopular, corrupt candidate, and the American people didn't like her. Nevertheless, just like in Britain, where the fact that Brexit was popular was blamed on Russian interference and Facebook misinformation. Same thing here. Facebook was to blame for Hillary having lost. So then this time around, I think they were determined to be extra zealous and extra. But I think it just revealed them to be such partisans. I don't know. That's all I have to say about that, I guess, is their motivations, because I'm not in the room when these decisions are made. But I think those two factors, the woke staffers combined with wanting to deflect blame in case Trump won again.
Do you view it as election interference, what they did?
I will just say again, look, a story came out involving demonstrating massive graft involving one of the two major party candidates. and you couldn't share it on Facebook. You couldn't share it on Twitter. You couldn't even share it on Twitter direct messages. So it's one thing to bar people from posting it on their public walls, but I couldn't send it to you via direct message. And a newspaper that had done that story had basically been put in a Twitter cage for 2 weeks.
Let's talk about the media's reaction to your story. Now, the New York Times came out and basically, and they wrote a story saying people within the New York Post, which is obviously your organization, people in the New York Post newsroom weren't happy with the story before it was published. They were sort of a bit unsteady about its sourcing and everything like that, and that perhaps some people thought within the New York Post it shouldn't have been published. And obviously lots of, the New York Post comes back at the New York Times and obviously publishes their own articles talking about people within the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. What's happened to the media? And can you just comment on that point that the New York Times made about people in the New York Post being sort of a bit unhappy with this story?
This will seem like a dodge, but I've honestly not been privy to any of the internal, because there's a wall between opinion and news in American newspapers. So I don't know who the people are who are involved in any of this, and so I can't really comment on it. What I will say is, again and again, the point that I've made is, the minute the story came out, Hunter Biden could say that those emails are not authentic. The minute the story came out, Joe Biden or Hunter could say that that laptop doesn't belong to us. More than nearly a month later, they've yet to do that. I mean, in other words, it would be the easiest shutdown to say it's all lies. But they didn't do that. They just said this is Russian disinformation, and then of course the New York Times trudged up some internal newsroom gossip on our side. But then none of that is a debunking of the facts of the story. And in fact, a former business partner of Hunter's came forward to confirm that those emails are real because he had been on one of those emails. So again, I think it just speaks to a kind of lack of curiosity on the part of my colleagues in other papers, where the reaction to a story like this isn't to be like, well, is it true or not? Easy, just let's dig. New York Times is a much wealthier paper. It has far more resources to report things than we do. Put some people on it, put 5 people on it, and dig through the material. They didn't do that. It was more important for them to run some, gossip on our internal deliberations, and to try to have this kind of debunking spirit instead of actually finding out, if it's true or not.
Let's talk about the New York Times, because that's a fascinating paper. What's happened to what they call the paper of record in America in the last few years with Donald Trump being president? They've had lots of high-profile resignations recently. I'm thinking of Barry Weiss. I'm thinking of when a Republican Senator, Tom Cotton, published an opinion piece in the New York Times. And people within the New York Times, journalists, obviously, they came and said, this is awful. Why are we publishing this opinion by a Republican? And the person who ran the editorial page, I've forgotten his name, James Bennett, he went on to resign because of the backlash, the internal backlash at the New York Times. Does that paper represent how the American media has changed, and what has happened to places like the New York Times?
Oh, it absolutely does. I would encourage everyone to read Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss and I worked together at the Wall Street Journal before we went our separate ways, and so I respect her enormously. I don't agree with her with everything, but I just think she's a serious person and a courageous voice. And I encourage everyone to read the public resignation letter that she wrote, which we published post, of course, with not a little pleasure, and just to read it, to see the atmosphere where she just describes that if a story runs against the kind of narrative, then it will come under enormous scrutiny from editors, whereas let's say they interview someone like Alice Walker, who's a great novelist, considered a great novelist, but also believes the Jewish Illuminati run the world. So she's a kind of conspiracy theorist. She's allowed to say stuff like this, and is it challenged by the paper? if a U.S. amid a massive riot where massive destruction is happening, U.S. Senator Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed saying, this requires possibly National Guard intervention to pacify the riots. The opinion editor, the ultimate opinion editor, had to resign. I mean, it's very, very Pravda-esque and weird, and it doesn't at all bespeak of any of the values we traditionally associate with journalism, which is kind of an adversarial relationship with anyone in power, an adversarial, not an adversarial, but a kind of curiosity where you think that, I'm going to talk to both sides and see where the truth lies in between the two side statements. It's all just sort of very far left, and it's sad and dangerous, really. What it does, I think it will lead to a kind of fracturing of the media landscape, because lots and lots of people are just not going to listen to mainstream media, and they will turn to either kind of conspiratorial voices, cranky conspiracy theorists and so forth, and others will just become independent voices. It's become very common now for journalists who, for one reason or another, run afoul of the narrative, the consensus. They go to Substack, where you can just publish a blog on your own and people pay you $5 a month. And in some cases, Glenn Greenwald, who was booted from his own outfit, The Intercept, or Matt Taibbi, are making, a lot of money because people just trust them. They don't trust the organization that used to employ them. So I think as a reporter and a writer, I see opportunity in that, obviously, with this kind of new, unstable landscape. But I worry about the fracturing that it also represents. A national newspaper should reflect a broad national opinion, not the opinions of a sort of narrow, urban, metropolitan class. But that's what the New York does. It represents the views of a very, very narrow metropolitan class, and even the far left wing of that class, not even the full spectrum of it. That's not a national, that has national reach.
Well, you're the op-ed editor at the New York Post, obviously a major newspaper in America. And this whole issue to do with publishing opinion pieces, which you may disagree with, is one that's obviously very relevant to your own job. Do you think it's the media's role, and I suspect I know the answer to this, but do you think it's the media's role to publish a diverse set of opinions in your own newspaper? Why do you think there's so much, in recent years, so much opposition to simply hearing the other side's point of view? I suppose they would argue, on the other hand, that what, for example, Tom Cotton was saying was beyond the pale, that he can, these arguments were racist, somehow racist or discriminatory, and that the New York Times rather, is no place to publish what they would probably view as hate speech or racism.
It's weird that they argued that it made New York Times reporters unsafe. It made them unsafe because, I don't know, because it makes no sense. The New York Times reporters are perfectly safe. They live in doorman buildings, and they're going to be fine. So I don't want to entertain the idea even too much. But that language of safety has become very common in Britain as well. But I think it's unfortunately, Douglas Murray wrote an op-ed for me where he said, I love America, but I wish you would stop exporting your wokeness. And he made a very good point. I have to mention this, that that there's like a Black Lives Matter protest in Trafalgar Square. And they were saying, the slogan of Black Lives Matter here is hands up, don't shoot. But the cops that were escorting the protest in Britain are actually unarmed police. So how are they going to shoot you? Anyway, that's besides the point. But the main point is this kind of therapeutic language has just pervaded everything where, your opinion makes me feel physically unsafe. I'm shaking because this is not a nation of adults if we're all like this. And I will say, we tend to publish right of center opinion. I don't deny that. It's not just like, on every issue we have a guy who's for higher taxes and a guy for lower taxes and so forth. But bear in mind that we're, yes, the opinion pages in the New York Post are conservative, representing the narrowest slice, if you take overall, of US media. All the networks, most of the networks except Fox News, all the sort of newspapers, except Wall Street Journal, New York Post, tend to be of the left. So we see our mission as just being like a little island of conservative opinion within mainstream media. That's a little bit different than where the Washington Post and the New York Times are. Even them, those outlets, they can be center left. It's fine, but it's one thing to say I'm broadly center left. It's another to be I'm so illiberal where I cannot even tolerate a centrist opinion. Like Barry Weiss is a centrist. She's no conservative, but her presence in the paper makes me feel unsafe. That's something else. I mean, the New York Times has always been liberal, but this new tone of censoriousness and illiberalism, all masked in the rhetoric of therapy and safety, that's the new thing that I think is just genuinely. People say Orwellian all the time, but I have no other adjective for it than Orwellian.
Well, I'm going to ask a very naive question from a British point of view, but I mean, I know the New York Post obviously is on the right, but New York itself is a democratic city. So how does that square up? And also, do you know these people in the New York Times? Do you sort of go for drinks with them and liaise like journalists like to do in London and with other journalists?
Yeah, I worked in London for 4 years, and I did drink with people at the Observer and the Guardian. I was at the Wall Street Journal Europe at the time, which is now defunct. It's now just Wall Street Journal, but it used to have a European edition, which was based in London. And you're right, I would drink with left-wing journalists, and we would disagree, but we did have too many beers. No, I have no, to be honest, and in terms of the social atmosphere here, I have no similar. I hang out with conservatives. I think I have liberal friends, but most of my liberal friends are not in journalism. They, and therefore are not. They can tolerate me. They're willing to still drink with me and disagree with me. But in terms of journalists, not really. It's unfortunate. Maybe that's my failing. Maybe I should go out and seek out more left-wing friends.
Perhaps. Joe Biden is currently calling for unity. That's what he said in his sort of semi-victory speech. CNN and all these media companies are all saying this is fantastic. The nation is going to be healing. We're going into a new era of lovely sort of skies filled with honey and things. What do you think of this idea of democratic unity?
I mean, every time there's a new leader, there's an opportunity to bring the nation together. I think that you should take these bits of rhetoric with a grain of salt, or a chunk of salt, because at the same time as they're saying that, a lot of progressives are saying, by the way, we need to make lists of anyone who said supportive things about Trump because they shouldn't be allowed to be employed, and we should sort of hold them accountable. There's something called the Trump Accountability Project, which is making lists of administration appointees and creating a kind of blacklist of Trumpian conservatives. I think it's the rhetoric rings especially hollow in this case. But look, there are things he could do. There are things Biden could do where you could say, is this a test? I'm going to write a column about this, a test of how the degree to which Biden really means it when he talks about unity. One clear one, which is a holdover from the Obama administration, is when they passed their healthcare law, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. There was a provision that insisted that all employer health plans have to include funding for abortions and abortifacients, like pills, the day after pill or whatever. And the Obama administration and then subsequently Democratic attorneys general took to court a group of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor because, as a matter of Catholic belief and their conscience, they refused to fund abortions and abortifacients. And so now fast forward to 8 years since the Obama administration, Joe Biden has an opportunity by relenting on this point. Although this is a sad part of the story, he's vowed to insist that the nuns have to pay for the abortions. So I don't know about, I'm pessimistic about unity.
Let's talk about 2024 briefly. Do you think Trump will come back? Should he come back? And let's say he doesn't come back and run again. Which Republican should take on Kamala Harris? I'm going to be quite cheeky and say that. I would suspect it won't be Joe Biden running for a second term, although I don't know. which Republicans should take the Democrats on, because there's this idea that Trump has been this big disruptor president, that's obviously very much a disruptive Republican figure, and there's a whole kind of group of Trumpists in the Republican Party now, but there's still obviously a lot of establishment Republicans, Nikki Haley and people like that, who are on the other wing of the party. So who should be taking on the Democrats?
Look, I think that this will bring our conversation full circle, but Trump pointed out that America wasn't working for the majority. It wasn't working out for lots of ordinary Americans. It works. If you look at the donations between the two candidates, it's fascinating. People who work with material reality, motorcycle repairmen, landscapers, roofers, generally they not only voted for Trump, but also donated small amounts to him. People who manipulate information on screens, university professors, software engineers, that sort of people, they voted for Biden. And the world, like I said, the liberal order that we have has worked really well for people like that, but it's not worked so well for working class people. And there's lots that where Republicans are to blame for this state of affairs, because they relentlessly promoted free trade without taking into account what free trade with China would do to domestic jobs here in the United States. Just one example. And the fact that that same type of voter, white, black, Hispanic, came out and supported Trump massively, 70 million votes, tells you that there's no going back for the Republican Party to that old elite consensus of free movement of goods, labor, and capital across borders, and kind of unlimited corporate power mixed with ever greater social liberalism on things like abortion, gay marriage. That was the old consensus, and Trump in every way broke it. And in breaking it, he expanded his support, including among minorities. It can't be repeated enough. So that all being said, what that tells me is that whoever comes around in 2024 has to reflect this new Republican Party. We've had a realignment among the parties where you now have, oddly enough, you have a right-wing party leading the working class, and you have the nominal party of the left representing the establishment. Corporations, big tech, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and HR, human resources managers, and so forth, are with the Democrats. So Republicans have to embrace the class forces that they represent. I'm going to sound like a Marxist here, but I'm really a conservative. I want conservative ends. I want families to do well. I want communities to do well. But that takes being realistic about the class dynamics of American society. And so the up-and-coming senators who I think have the guts, but also the understanding to realize that this is the new alignment of the parties, that the left increasingly aligns with the elite and the right is the representative of the working class. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, top of that list. You mentioned Tom Cotton. I think he's fairly woke to this. He understands this. Marco Rubio of Florida increasingly talks about the economy has to work for the American people, not the other way around. We have a free market to help people, not people for the sake of a market. So, the government has to be willing to intervene when markets fail workers, fail communities. So those are three names that I can just think of off the top of my head who are tending in this direction. But if you know, they have fewer of Trump's unique flaws as well. So that's very exciting for me, because it means that this kind of populism is not just tied to one personality. It has legs, and other torchbearers can move it forward who may be more articulate, more systematic about how to run the federal government once you have power. And so I'm very optimistic. If Kamala Harris doesn't send social conservatives like me to kind of gulag the next 4 years, then in 2024 we have a lot of opportunities.
It's fascinating to watch on both sides of the Atlantic, the working class go to the centre-right parties. And Boris Johnson won his election last year because those Labour seats in the north of England, which were heavily working class, all really went for Boris. And I think a lot of that was about identity. It was about being proud to be British. And as you say, economic populism, and this whole cultural idea of where the left has really sort of picked up this culture war in recent years. I think that's alienated a lot of working class voters. I want to ask you one more question, and this is a bit of a sort of curveball question. I've interviewed on this show Rita Panahi, who's a Sky News Australia commentator. She's also from Iran. She grew up in Iran, and she had to, I think she said, for example, that she had to sing "Death to America" in her classrooms. And I've read on your Wikipedia page that you've written about your experiences in Iran as a child, and then obviously you came over to America when you were pretty young. Can you just give viewers, because I find this absolutely fascinating, these are, you know, Iranian right-wingers coming over to Western countries, becoming celebrities. Can you talk about your experiences in Iran after the revolution, and what it was like? How did you feel when you came to America and experienced this whole new culture?
So I've written a book about this. I wrote a memoir that came out in 2019. It's about why I became a Roman Catholic. So I'm a convert. And so it's difficult for me to sum up the entire memoir into a book. But as it happens, I was received into the Catholic Church in London. So yeah, I mean, I think I would point your viewers to the book. But on the whole, I would say that, look, living under the Islamic Republic made me become an atheist at age 13. And I came to the West expecting, you know, a world of limitless freedom where I could define myself every day. I wasn't bound by tradition. I wasn't bound by God, and reveling in that. But believe it or not, by the end of that, by the time I was in my late 20s, it left me quite miserable. And I was back searching for, there has to be some transcendent meaning to life more than just, you know, hedonism, career success, and individualism. And so, you know, it's a much longer process than I could summarize here, but through kind of reading Pope Benedict's books, going to mass accidentally a couple of times, I ended up being received into the Catholic Church in Britain before then, now immigrating back, not immigrating, but returning to the United States. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey, because a typical Iranian reaction is to just say, to hell with all religion, because I've suffered under theocratic Islam. Well, that's not the case with me. I'm not a Muslim, but in leaving behind Iran, I have not left behind all religiosity, and I recognize in myself as human beings are a religious animal. They yearn for understanding who their creator is, and you know, I believe I met him in the Catholic Church.
That's really interesting, and obviously you've got a new book coming out next year, which I think partly sounds to me like that it touches on that. In that, you know, this is a very popular topic that you're talking about now, and that is returning to ancient traditions, returning to religious values. Because I find it interesting that when you came to the West, and I think I experienced this, and many people experience this, is, let's say, when you're an atheist, or not even just an atheist, but just someone growing up in the 21st century, you feel like you are lacking a purpose in life, and there's no longer this set of moral guidelines and values that you can live by. And with social media and all these other factors, it's caused a huge rise in depression and chaos in people's lives. And people like Jordan Peterson come in and talk about these issues, about how you can take back personal responsibility, and obviously religion you found is a big way of doing that. So perhaps next year's book, which viewers can go and read in 2021, will touch on that. Yes,
so it's called The Unbroken Thread. The subtitle kind of says it is Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. And I wrote it more for my son, because I now have a 3-year-old son. I have a daughter as well, but I have a 3-year-old son. And I just sort of worry about what kind of world our very disorienting, disordered way of life will chisel out of him. And so I wanted to transmit all the best that I knew and had thought through or read to him. And so the book poses 12 unasked questions, or fundamental questions we don't ask. Is God reasonable? You know, how should you serve your parents? Should you always think for yourself? And it explores each of them through the life of one great thinker, including 2 Britons, C.S. Lewis and John Henry Newman. Fantastic. All right. Well, viewers can go and read that book next year. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Stephen.